Are you old enough to be a social worker? That is the question that I was so scared that somebody would ask me. It is a question that I was then asked repeatedly in my placements, in my first year as a newly qualified social worker. I think I've been asked that question every single year of my social work career. Whatever stage I've been at, even when I was a conference chair, I've still had comments about my age and what I look like and the implications of that on my practice. And I know so many of you have the same fear and also have the same questions asked to you, whether you are on placement or in your first year of practice. I've had, are you old enough to be a social worker? What would you know? You look like you've just come out of school. Are you even old enough to do this job? What would you know? You look about 12. What are the other things that I've had? How long have you been doing this? When did you graduate, or when did you first qualify as a social worker? I've had comments like, I want to speak to your manager and I hope they're a bit older than you. So many things, all the things that I feared actually would happen, all the comments that I thought would be made have been made. Obviously, I predicted those comments would be made because I've always known that I looked younger, and I kind of feel like when you know you look younger than your age, it isn't like bragging of like, oh, look how youthful I am. It's just a reflection. Like, I've always been ID'd. I still get ID'd. I'm 33. And I think that I just know that people think that about me. I know that I sound young as well, if that's even a thing. I've actually got a bit of a sore throat today, which probably makes my voice slightly deeper, but I know that I've got, or in my head, I've got quite a high pitched voice. So it's something that I've always been so conscious of. And there's lots of judgments and connections when it comes to age, and I think in social work it flips on both sides. I don't know what it feels like for people to say, oh, you're too old to do this. It's always been about looking too young, but it really speaks to this idea or this narrative that age equals experience. And I know I'm susceptible to that narrative. If I go to the doctors and the doctor looks the same age as me or the same perceived age as me, or I perceive that doctor to look younger than me, I have a judgment in my head immediately that they're not going to know as much as a doctor who looks maybe 10 or 20 years older than me. So I know I'm susceptible to that bias. I know that I am ageist in so many ways, but I'm able to step back and reflect on it. And probably what you will find and what I found is that the people who were making those comments to me, it was usually parents, maybe grandparents, carers. It was all coming from a place of fear, and it was all rooted in these narratives that age equals experience. And I want to unpick those with you and talk to you about ways that I have responded to questions like that in the past, to keep myself safe, to make sure that I'm not internalizing anything, but also to hold some space for that person's fear, which I think is usually at the root of any of those questions of, are you old enough to do this? But before I do, if I'm new here, oh God. If you are new around here, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel, like the video if it's helpful for you, leave me a comment, let me know yes or no if you have ever come up against this type of question in practice before. And if you want to know about all the ways that I can help and support you in your first year as a social worker, head to the show notes. All the information you need is there. So I know that when somebody challenges me about my age, it feeds in to an existing idea that I have that I don't know enough or I'm not experienced enough, which goes back to this really simple belief of I'm not good enough. So if this is you, if you find yourself feeling really challenged when people come at you because of your age, really sit back and start to unpick, why is that triggering you so much? Do you already hold a belief that your experience isn't what it should be? Because if I wasn't aware of that, and I wasn't always aware of that when I was a new social worker, those comments would just feed my self-doubt, and it wasn't helpful. The next thing to do is offer yourself some reassurance, because you will struggle to go into an environment where you are challenged on things like your age and your appearance without having that internal reassurance. Okay, you might be being perceived as younger. What are the benefits of that? Does it mean that you're able to connect with people in a different way? doesn't mean that you understand certain forms of discrimination. And yes, we have to consider intersectionality here because some people are discriminated against so much more than their age, but what perspective does it give you? If that challenge is triggering thoughts of I'm not good enough, I don't know enough, remind yourself what you do know. Remind yourself of your strengths. What are the things that you are really good at? Where is your knowledge at its peak? What kind of feedback do you get from people that you work alongside, whether that is children, families, colleagues, supervisors? Remind yourself of all those things. Why is that important? Because you can go into the next part of the conversation feeling more confident. The next thing to do is think about your response. When I was newly qualified, and when I was a student actually, and I had this real fear that somebody was going to say, are you even old enough to be a social worker? I just got caught up in that. And if it wasn't for somebody stopping me and saying, okay, well, if that happens, Vicky, what are you going to say? I would have just stayed in that cycle of panic. So it's important to just think about how you are going to respond in that moment. And there's no right way or wrong way. Some responses may not work, but there are a couple of things that are helpful to think about. The first is to try not to be defensive. I know it is difficult, but like I talked about before, everybody asks a question for a reason, and there will always be a feeling underpinning a question, particularly one that is about your age and that infers something about your experience or lack of experience. You can ask questions like, what age do you think people need to be? You can reflect on things like, why do you think age matters? You can open up a conversation about what is the difference between age and experience. You can reflect back to people. So I've had family members before, again, saying things like, are you even old enough to be a social worker? Sometimes I would respond back and say, a lot of people ask me that question. I know I look quite young for my age, and just sit with that honesty. Sometimes you can just say yes to answer the question, but without being passive aggressive or defensive, because it's so unhelpful. If you are a student or newly qualified, you can say this. I think a lot of people have a real fear of just telling the truth and saying, yeah, well, I am actually a student, or I am newly qualified. And I know not every newly qualified social worker is of a certain age, but if they're asking you a question about your age and they are making an inference about your experience, I think it's more than okay to be honest with them about that. Again, if I had a doctor, I'm using lots of medical references, but if I had a doctor and they told me that they were newly qualified, I would respect and appreciate that honesty. Would I still maybe want to speak to somebody who'd been qualified for longer? Yes, but that's okay. And it's okay for families that you're working with to ask you questions about your experience, because this is their life, this is their children. This is what most of us would do if anybody was intervening in our lives, whether that is because we want them to or we don't want them to. Sometimes, only sometimes, I would also use humour. Now, I think it's really important to be careful when we're using humour because we don't want to undermine somebody's real fear. But there have definitely been families that either I've known well or I've been able to build a rapport with where I've made comments like, do you know what? I got asked for ID for paracetamol the other day. So yeah, I know I look really young. Whatever that is, and again, you have to be really careful with that because it depends on that family's sense of humour, it depends on the situation, but there is nothing wrong with owning that and using that to open up a little bit of a discussion. I think it can be really helpful to reflect some of your experience back. I'm going to go back to my medical reference again, but there's been times when I've spoken to parents and said, do you know what, if I went to the doctor and the doctor looked really young, I'd probably be worried about that. I might think that they don't know enough. I might think that they're not able to help me, and I might not trust them. And I wonder if that's how you might feel about me because you think that I look too young to be a social worker. Rather than it being an elephant in the room, let it be something to talk about. Because the final thing that I want to say is that this feeds into a wider societal issue and assumption about age and experience. Yes, this works in lots of different ways because social workers enter their profession at all different ages, but I'm just focusing on this idea of youth and this assumption that younger means less experienced. Now, maybe if you're on placement, you haven't experienced this yet, or as a newly qualified social worker, you are starting to experience this yet, but I have met children, young people in my job who have more life experience than adults 4 times their age. They have more wisdom, more knowledge, more insight than any of the adults that are around them. And so if we make this assumption, or if we support or underpin this assumption that age has to equal experience, we devalue the experience of children and what they tell us and their voice. And I really like to hold that thought in mind when anyone challenges me on my age. Sometimes it's even other professionals who might make comments of, oh, I've been doing this far longer than you have, or I bet you were in school when I started in this job. I've had all of those before. And so that can be a really helpful reminder to people, at the same time as centering a child in what you do, to challenge those assumptions about age and experience. If this has been helpful for you, please let me know. Make sure that you subscribe. Leave me a comment as to whether this has resonated, if you want more videos like this, and if you've got any suggestions for social workers in how they can respond if they are also asked this question and challenged on their age. Everything you need to know, how to get in touch with me, links to my free ebook download and to information about my membership is all in the show notes. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.